Okay, I think we're live here. Well met, Visley. This evening, we are going to dive into the thick of politics and factionalism and how to make that messy and gnarly for your players. And how to not go too crazy with it yourself.
Amen to that.
Yeah. As always, I'm Jordan. This is Tyler. We do game mastering for various RPGs, including currently I'm running an Invisible Sun campaign, and
I'm running a D&D campaign.
Yeah. So we're covering, the gamut. But I'm also a player right now in the Dungeons and Dragons Waterdeep Heist campaign from Wizards of the Coast. And that's a very city politics factional game. They have a number of different factions that you can become a member of, or you can be fighting against. Who the big bad ends up being differs depending on how the GM decides to arrange the material. And there's a lot of formal factions, but then also like criminal gangs and things. And my character, of course, managed to piss off a noble family. So you have like the noble family interpolitics as well. Mm-hmm. There's more on that thread that you don't know yet.
Oh gosh. Even what I know about your character is enough to try the patience of an oyster. I mean, good grief.
So I have a barbarian bard in that campaign, and he was at one point hired to sully the name of an opposing nobleman's son. And I did so victoriously, and he is now permanently known as a syphilitic ord. So
oh no. Oh
so,
no.
Yeah, the father and a goon came by my bar one night and broke all the bones in my hand. Good times. But yeah, I mean, one of the tricky things with factions, so in that case, they give you a whole suite of, here's the ones that exist, and then the GM and the players kind of both end up deciding which ones are going to matter. And so part of the challenge with this is you have a couple different ways that you can structure factions, and people who are vying to maintain or transform the status quo of power, right? That's really what this comes down to. And so you have some kind of baseline organization that exists. By organization, I don't mean like a membership organization, but in terms of like the dynamics of all the different parties in power. And whether or not that gets maintained or not is really the open question. And the default for most people is that there is just a static background. I'm going to move a little bit to be more in picture. There's a static background where this is just the social environment, and it's largely fixed. Like a lot of people run games where it's just like the king is the king, and we're not really going to do anything more than that. For me, I'm much more interested in, I love the social drama. I love the political drama. And there's a whole spectrum that can kind of be played into with that. So what's been your experience, either as a player or as a DM, bringing to life some of these different tensions, and in terms of like maintaining the status quo or in terms of disrupting it?
Now, as a player, I have never yet been in a game where someone was playing with a backdrop of actively changing people in positions of high power that had an impact on what we were doing. As a DM, I have at least once now tried to have, okay, this is going to take a little bit to articulate, because having never properly written it down in any sort of properly explanatory way, it might come across.
This will be the oral tradition.
Exactly. And it'll be about as bad as you think, probably. So the players that I had walked into a city to find that the city was basically run by 5 different people representing 5 different interests. There was one representing the populace. There was one representing the magical university. There was one representing the religious organizations, in particular and in prominence, the Temple of Bahamut at the time. There was one representing the army, and there was one representing commerce.
Yeah.
What I had going on there was an attempted creep of influence via mind flayers into subordinate members of the religious order that were impacting the decision-making of what the religious order tried to do on a macro scale in terms of their support for an intercity war. Ultimately, the goal here was, if the mind flayers had their way, there were not many of them, and they had to work via proxies. They were trying to get the religious order to get the war started, to get the army out of the city so that they could come up and have some free reign dealing with the populace, and therefore possibly have a chance to breed and have a more stable food supply that wasn't threatened by a whole lot of army factions. But in order to facilitate some of this, there was also some blackmail between head leaders of the religious order and the magical university, who was from the other city in her origins and in her ancestry. And if that were properly exposed at a crucial point, could be a way to discredit her opposition to the war as traitorous, and therefore a means to ensure that the war did go ahead, that the university was discredited, and that their voice in the council would no longer matter. And the players got thrown into that and had to deal with the mind flayers while the crap was going on around them.
See, that's a perfect example of like, oh, here's a monster encounter that feeds into this much broader linked set of systems. And that's, I think, the challenge, especially if you have a player group that is more used to a monster of the week type structure. Throwing them wholesale into like a social political drama can be rough going.
It's rough going for me because I'd never done something that complicated before, and I felt like half the time I was flying by the seat of my pants. It's definitely an instance of the way I role-played some of the reactions to the fallout of what happened. Definitely could have used a lot of work. To me, in retrospect, it lacked some believability and some drama, even though throughout the entire thing, the players kept saying, no, we're having fun. This is really cool. And so that at least was good in the moment. But yeah, I've got a lot to learn on trying to pull the threads together in a cohesive manner.
A game that does this really well, I mean, that's really structured around this, is The Legend of the Five Rings, which is kind of like a fantasy feudal Japan. And one of my favorite modules to run just ever is the Wedding at Kyoto Castle, which, you know, in this setting, you have these 7 major clans, and then there's families within the clans, and then there's individual lords within the families. And so who your lord is, who your family is, who your clan is, says just a ton about you. And almost everybody's playing some kind of samurai. Not always like a bushy warrior. Sometimes it might be like a shugenja, like a magician of sorts, or a monk, or some, you know, a courtier. Like you could be a samurai version of all of those things. But so the setting of this module is basically an alliance, a political alliance marriage, right, between the Crane and the Phoenix clan. And the Crane are at war with, there's kind of like a border war with the Lion clan. And so this is a way to kind of get the edge up. The Scorpion clan is like considering how to kind of scuttle this thing. And there's and then your characters can be from whichever, right? And so they basically come in as guests to this wedding, and you arrive and someone has slaughtered a bunch of cranes outside of the shrine where the wedding's supposed to go. And it's like, this is incredibly inauspicious. And you know, either this is like some ill omen, or someone's really trying to sabotage this alliance. And then it gets, you know, even weirder and more interesting. But, you know, the way that we structured, the last time I ran it, one of the characters had a personal quest, which was he was searching for his uncle, who the castle that this takes place in was one of the first castles that the Crane had taken from the Lion. So this was originally a Lion clan castle.
Okay.
And he basically hadn't seen his uncle since that castle was taken, but he wasn't counted among the dead. And so there's this sort of like open question as to whether or not. And at a certain point, they all decide, like, no, we're going to, all the players, I started the game off basically asking them whether or not they were willing to have a game where they were at odds with each other. Because I would kind of steer it one way or the other. And they're like, well, we're we're amenable to that. Like, we're not going to start the game trying to foil each other.
Right.
Yeah, but you know, if it happens, we're willing to go that way, which was great because at a crucial moment, the revelation of who the uncle was revealed, and that character stood with his uncle against the other players, and it upset the whole situation. It was brilliant, but it was one of those things where you had this overloading of family and clan, and you're looking at the broader political situation of like, what does this mean for this border war?
And the individual choices about which level of connection matters most. Because there's the loyalty to your lord, there's the loyalty to your family, there's the loyalty to your clan, but they'll be stacked in different tiers for different people. For some people, it'll be loyalty to the person of their lord. For some people, it'll be loyalty to family above all, even when the family works against the clan to some degree or other. And for some, it's the clan and heaven help the poor family member who shames the clan, or the lord who works against the clan because I am against them in the name of the clan. And so you can get multi-tiered political stuff even within people who ostensibly share the same loyalties if they don't quite play out in the same orders.
I mean, this is what makes the Jane Austen, like, I'm really looking forward to running a game of Good Society where everyone's just having tea, and it's super intense social drama about like who's going to marry whom and like who's going to become named in the will and whatever, right? Like, because you have the same kind of dynamics there. And like in the last Wedding of Quixote that I ran, a little bit of a spoiler here, but basically an old lover of the Crane Lord shows up, and she's in the Lion Clan, although he didn't know that when they had been together. And she basically says, like, I'm actually going to marry him, and I'm actually going to take control of the castle. And the other players, the players all negotiated, like, we can help you get married and leave. And then she was basically, when it became clear that like there was no way that she could both marry him and keep the castle, she killed him.
It's like, okay, wedding's off.
Yeah, wedding's off, and her soldiers stormed the gates. And so it became this really fascinating moment of like, what's more important to this character right now? And so running your NPCs and being able to have a sense of like, what are they willing to bend on? And this was great. I've been rereading a little bit of Taiko by Iji Yoshikawa, which is, again, like fantastic factionalism, because you have an impotent emperor in Kyoto, and you have like 40-something provinces with various warlords. But
that one, the most part is the larger army trying to go through the Oda clan, and Nobunaga just absolutely obliterating them.
Yeah, but like every conflict is balanced on a different dynamic. You know, sometimes it's just a matter of bribe the guy and pass through, right?
Yep.
Sometimes, like you said, you know, there's the ferocious stand. And so when you start mapping out politics, there's a couple of major things that I tend to track. The first one is, you know, making a note of like, who are the major players. And a really important thing for me is that thinking of it in terms of like, these are the 7 corporations or the 7 tribes or the, you know, 18 countries or whatever is not the most effective way to do it, because the significant players aren't necessarily all of the same type, and your game is more interesting when they're not. So when you start saying, oh, there's a really influential intellectual, and there's a significant corporation or trading guild, there's a really significant church, right? That's being, you know, that's on the down and out. There's an imperial dynasty, and you know, the real hand of power is in the nobles who are fractured, right? Like you can come up with, you know, 6 or 7 different types of things that interweave, and then within each of those, you might have a handful that actually matter.
If I can interject on this front, one of the best points about having these people of influence being of different types, at least in part, if not in whole, is the fact that it is almost easier to make relational points between sections to go, well, why does this person or this corporation or this group matter to this one over here? And like if you look at the intellectual, what are they speaking on? What is the philosophy they are espousing, and who does it benefit? Because whatever they are, whatever it is that makes them influential, there's going to be another group that benefits from that philosophy, and by consequence there's going to be some other people who don't benefit from it, but is probably on a different point. And so it helps to give you points of connection from one type of thing to another. Also, there's follow the money. Who's got the money? Who has need of the money? Who sees the money pass through their hands even though they don't own it? So like the nobles might have all the assets, the bankers handle the money.
The nobles might be, you know, up to their eyeballs in gambling debt, and all their money is more virtual than actual.
Yeah, like, and there's
War and Peace has some interesting dynamics like that.
Yeah, these connections, they almost write themselves sometimes. If you've read any history, if you read any novels that have any political aspects to them, you've seen these dynamics. You've seen the creditor-debtor dynamics. You've seen the hot-headed person and how they can be exploited. You've seen the heady intellectual and where his philosophy can lead. You've seen it in the real world. You've seen it in history. You've seen it in fiction. It's everywhere.
I started rewatching, so I'll move off of, you know, Far East Asian history at some point, but I started rewatching The Three Kingdoms, the Chinese television show based off of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And like, you would get all of the types. You get all of the types, and it's awesome to see like how all these different persona types and power dynamics, and, you know, sometimes, you know, somebody might be really excellent, but they're young and they feel like they have something to prove, and that causes them to overreach, or, you know, whatever their downfall is. The strategy that I found really useful for if I'm not using the same type of entity across the board, then you end up with the challenge of, how do I create a taxonomic structure that allows me to very simply divide this up? And the easiest way to do that is to create several, you know, binaries or gradients, right? Like scales, where you pose a specific question and you're like, where does everybody fall in this question? So for example, in my game of Invisible Sun right now, the city of Saturnine is fractured similarly to how Japan in the 1500s was fractured. You have a nominal leader in the Marquis Quarter, and you have 16 other quarters that are basically self-governed. I mean, there's a nominal leadership, but there isn't an effective leadership. And the big question, and borrowing a little bit from Pratchett's Discworld and the city of Ankh-Morpork, is if there were a tyrant to kind of come in and just wrangle the whole city towards some end, how would these different groups and parties respond to that? And what are the questions that they would ask about it? So in some cases, it's like, so there's an in favor, not in favor. But then there's like, in favor if he's one of us, or in favor if
he's not one of them.
Yeah, so in favor, but not in an interventionist way. Like we're fine with that kind of mode if it's not like a external warfare mode, or we're fine with it as long as, you know, the trains run on time, or we're not fine with it and we think that all the authority should actually be, you know, maintained at a local level. And so it's kind of like a question of federalism to some degree, question of, you know, tyrant, and then you can have game events change the answers to that question. So you go, okay, in peacetime as it is, here's what people's answers are as to whether or not there should be like a unified leadership structure. What happens when you're dealing with an invasion? You know, how does that change where people fall? So, you know, when you end up with, you know, 2 or 3 different leading questions like this, you can end up with a really intriguing map where your 7 or 12 different factions, I wouldn't go more than 12, holy cow, they're going to cut across different lines, and you're going to be able to find the same people on different sides of different questions. And so sometimes they'll be allies and sometimes they'll be opposed. And so that's where, when you talked about the hierarchy of priorities, that's where you can get the shifting of priorities. You can say, this person is normally my enemy, but because of this,
because they are threatened by this, by the same thing I am, but in this capacity, they will ally with me to see the end of this threat for as long as it remains a threat. How can I exploit that need for to be an ally?
Yeah, exactly. And so the one example that is really active in my campaign right now is the ministers of Satyrine are natural allies with the Order of Goetics, because they both want a really strong centralized government, but they both want to be in charge. And so where they butt heads is who's calling the shots. And when the Order of Goetics found out that the Ministry of Public Works was calling some shots that they didn't even know about, they got pissed and responded. Or they're about to respond, I guess.
They haven't quite got there yet. But when they
haven't quite got there yet. But it also allows you, you talked a little bit about income and economy and stuff like that. And one of the things that my players are dealing with is they just dealt with a hate cyst, which is basically like a magical ordinance from the before war that had ruined entire districts of the city. They were just, they aren't habitable, right? The players have just removed it. And in our session this coming Saturday, they'll decide like who they tell, what they do, etc. But one of the things that, if you're my players, just stop listening now, plug your ears, it's fine. Yeah, is they've just rescued a district. They've cleared it. They've basically mineswept it.
Right.
So now you're going to have a land grab, and who finds out first will matter. And possession being 9/10 of the law, blah blah blah. Like, it will be very intriguing to see how that disrupts things, and I don't know how that's going to end up. I have a few different ideas.
Going to tell
exactly. So order is going to matter here, because whoever they tell who understands the implications of this is going to make a land grab. And then they're going to be the force that the others have to displace if they choose to displace them.
Now, the players themselves, have they considered this aspect at all? And if so, do you think that they themselves are going to try and lay claim to any of it? Or do they not have enough standing either on their own or within their own organizations to make that even a feasible option?
So I have two player hooks for this one. One of them is, one of the players is a Goetic who is looking for a specific type of animal that he knows lives there. He's seen one. He wants to go back. He wants to find it. So when he goes back to find it, he's going to find that, oh, there's people setting up shop here. So there's going to be a discovery element there. One of the other players used to live there. Now, this was like basically uninhabitable, but she lived in this little like warehouse thing, which is where they ultimately found the hate cyst. And her house, the reason she was able to live there was that she basically warded it. She had this like super powerful magical protection. Okay. That's tied to her, which means when people try to reconstruct, they're going to find that they can't do so unless she consents to it. What's great is that she doesn't know this. Like, she knows that she ended up there, but it's going to make her very decisive to what happens.
And either decisive in terms of people maneuvering her into position, or decisive in terms of her deciding how things are going to go. Influential either way, as someone else's piece or as her own mover.
Yeah. Yeah, I got the idea from the nail houses that I showed you before, where you have, just some of those absurd construction projects out in China where you have a massive road and then there's like some little house in the middle of it that they just routed the road around because you had some super stubborn homeowner that was like, you won't take my house. And they're just like, fine, we're going to build skyscrapers all around you or put you in the middle of a highway.
Totally.
Yeah.
People are never that petty.
Never.
No, actually, the problem is unfortunately, it involves mentioning a name that probably ought not to be spoken, but the presiding member of the United States had a instance like that, apparently, of some people who live in Scotland, I want to say near Aberdeen, with some golf courses, with his branding, and doing everything he possibly could for those people who refused to sell their houses and allow him to build there, to make their lives a living hell.
Yeah.
I imagine it's a similar sort of concept here.
Yeah, well, and the thing is like,
everything you liked about living here is now gone, except your house.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, is like, she can completely just live there and make people's lives hell if she wants. Like, that's a legit. But the key thing there is building in little hooks so that people care and people can lean into things.
Yep.
So, for example, going back to the Waterdeep Heist campaign, because you know how I play, there was a session way early in the campaign where I was injured really, really badly, and someone took me in and basically got me 5-star medical treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically wrote them an IOU, and I'm like, when my luck turns around, I will pay you back. And then about halfway through the campaign, I learned, like, I try to pay it back, and I find out that somebody bought my debt, and I don't know who. And
that's bad. I've read too much Jim Butcher and Harry Dresden books to think that could be possibly good. It's like when the Fae trade in debts. That's a really bad situation.
So I'm hosting my monthly high stakes poker game behind the bar kind of thing. Mm-hmm. When the father of the son whose name I just destroyed walks into the bar and presents me with a piece of paper showing that not only did he buy my debt, but it's been accruing interest at 25% per day. I owe 20,000 gold pieces. I'd never signed these papers, but it's my signature on the document. And the whole side session was basically resurrecting this thing. And we leveraged it into playing him against some of the other leading families in the city and, doing all that. But like, that was something where, because I had left these breadcrumbs, the GM was able to pick them up and go, all right, we're going to take these and we're going to pull you in to being for or against, a certain person. What does that mean for your role with this other family? What does that mean for your role, whether or not you are supporting the police or in league with like some criminal cartel? Like, that's going to matter, and that's going to affect who you're able to talk to, what you're able to do. It's going to change the tenor of the story significantly.
Totally. That's fantastic. Good God, it makes it feel like it's putting to shame everything I've ever done. But the closest I have to anything like that is the fact that one of my players in my D&D campaign, she's playing a Black Dragonborn. She's not from the area, but her home city was destroyed. Like, not just the people left, I mean, like, people were annihilated. She was like one of very few people of an entire city to escape. It was destroyed by combination army and battle magic that the city was completely unprepared for. And then I ended up drawing in a connection between the person who burned her city and her previous character via an ancient dragon of the same color scheme that was otherwise almost unheard of, but whose gemstone variety shared a type both with her previous character and with this wizard. And so now she's talking to essentially the progenitor of this particular branch of gemstone dragonborn. And so this is a distant relation of the dragons who kill her city.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, and getting into, so understanding like the fractal levels of governance and conflict too is another really, really phenomenal thing. Like, have you heard of the Crusader Kings 3? It's a new video game that came out recently.
It sounds familiar.
So I haven't played it. I've just been reading about it a bit. It sounds super up my alley, but there's a couple things that they really highlight. Part of it was just that you have these large scale wars that are often the expressions of much smaller disagreements, right? And the things that are happening like within families across some of the ruling families, you know, this person marries this person and that really impacts whether there's war and peace in this region. This person, you know, murders their father and takes over. Okay, well, that has these other implications. This person switches faiths and now all of a sudden, like, all their political alliances change, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
And I really like that, but someone was writing a little bit of a critique about it. And one of the things that they were saying is that the game is a little bit too binary with war and peace, like total war versus total peace. And it doesn't really reflect how much raiding and border incursions were just like an endemic state that, you know, full-blown war was notable as a full-blown war, but there's a lot of like just, you know, edge case things that, you know, as long as it didn't really fully erupt into something, that it's just like, well, you know, we'll make you give something else up in exchange. Or maybe it's just like a rogue noble who, you know, like you start reading A Distant Mirror by Barbara, I'm blanking on her last name. It's a history of the 14th century and the Black Death, but through the lens of a couple specific people. And when you start like reading about some of the nobles and knights of that era, they sound closer to like, you know, Mexican cartels. And it's like, are you at war or are you at peace? It's like, well, it depends. Was there a clash between two cartels and the state police? Because that's just a thing that happens all the time in some of these spaces. So getting a sense of like, what are the endemic conflicts of the world that are of your world, you know, whatever it is, where they might be notable, but they're not surprising and they're not decisive. They're not shifting the balance of power.
And if anything, they might also be maintaining the power of that system that currently exists. Oh
yeah, well, especially if you have things where it's just like, as long as you guys are fighting distractedly, I can stay ensconced.
Totally. And you might have people who are in power, if they find that their position is threatened, they'll do things like employ a third party via tenuous external connection from anyone else's point of view to go and cause trouble and take the blame as a separate party for their benefit. So that, you know, like you're hiring a bunch of raiders who are themselves definitely their own side, who will appreciate having a chance to perform their craft of raiding, but who will also have a connection to you insofar as they are directly benefiting you and benefiting the capacity for you to maintain the power structure you have, and that their presence in their disruption is a play that you are making at a distance to ensure that a rival doesn't supplant you. Like that sort of stuff would happen.
Well, if you're dealing with the question of like, does the system stay stable or not? I really like the concepts from Selectorate theory that were highlighted in the Dictator's Handbook. It's not strictly about dictatorship. It's really about any kind of leadership structure. Okay. The thing with Selectorate theories, it's basically saying the Selectorate are the people that you need to keep happy in order to gain or maintain power. So in principle, like, democracy should widen that to be a larger pool of people than dictatorships. Although it really depends on the democracy and it really depends on the dictatorship. But generally speaking, you're going to have a more stable system the fewer and more consistent those people are. And where that then becomes unstable is where those people change or are removed for some reason, or where what they want or what you're able to provide changes suddenly. So like if you're giving people money and then you run out of money, all of a sudden, you know, the currency in favor doesn't really work for you. But you can have other things too, where the currency that you're operating with suddenly gets devalued overnight. Like if you're banking on like, I'm I'm the proxy to these foreign powers, and they speak through me. I represent them. They're way more powerful than you can deal with. You want them on your side, therefore you need to be in my good graces. Like that's a positional thing, where you can very easily upset that and have somebody else suddenly come in and be like, actually, I'm the person. And now you have a leadership crisis.
And when you have a lot riding on a single person like that, it becomes almost a lot easier to cause an upset too, because one person can have accidents. Groups are much harder to dislodge.
Well, and that's the other thing, is that the Selectorate doesn't necessarily. Sometimes you get one Selectorate is completely replaced by a different one, right? Revolutions tend to be like that. But a lot of times the leadership gets swapped out, but the Selectorate doesn't get changed dramatically. The structure is more or less the same. The figurehead might be different.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. You keep the same diplomats, you keep the same bureaucracy, but the person calling the shots is changed. And so it causes a slight change in focus, but there's enough in place with enough inertia to prevent it from being derailed into another direction completely. Yeah.
Well, and the thing is like if the social fabric frays significantly enough, you don't get a nice clean cutover, and you end up with. There's a period of time where there's 3 contested popes. Did you ever know that?
Yes, I think I did. And they all communicated each other simultaneously.
Yeah, I mean, you end up with these weird moments, and you don't actually know, like, where's this going to land? And a lot of time,
loyalty somewhere, and they might choose wrong. And if they do choose wrong and can't change their loyalty later on when the outcome is becoming inevitable and obvious to all, they're sunk.
And so if you have a game that's set in some kind of like super tumultuous period, kind of a revolutionary period, or a period of massive warfare where there's so many of the material and social infrastructure has been destroyed or is up for grabs, then you can have outliers that come in and just snatch it, right? I read a biography of Lenin 10 years ago or so, and what was fascinating was just how improbable it was that the Bolsheviks in particular would be the ones to like run that to the finish line. Because, okay, yeah, I mean, they met the baseline criteria to not fail. But it was far from obvious that they would be the winning faction in a post-revolutionary Russia. And you see that time and time again, where if you have an unstable enough situation, then you can like actually really plausibly widen your scopes considerably to suddenly have somebody sweep in out of the wings and take everything.
Okay, I'm going to interject something, an additional facet to this that I remember reading about through history books. And in this case, I'm talking about West Asia as compared to Europe.
Okay.
West Asia, by which I mean like the Persian Empire sort of things through Northern Arabia into that sort of areas. When we talk about wars and political upheaval and major conflicts, there was a different undulation of the sort of conflicts that they had versus what Europe had. Geography matters. This is ultimately one of the things that's really important to remember here when it comes to the politics of war and peace. Geography matters. In Europe, you've got a lot of people in close proximity with a lot of little natural borders that make it difficult to extend influence beyond your area, even when you need to, which means you've got all these places for pockets of power to develop and lots of little conflicts to develop because of all these things. There's mountains between Italy and Northern Europe. You've got these choke points, like where Spain comes into France. You've got the channel between England and France. You've got all these other little bits and pieces of things that split the country up and make it into weird shapes and make it hard to access all of it. West Asia and also China, actually, you've got larger swaths of land that are generally accessible. You can expect to rule a larger portion of land with less effort because the geography works in your favor. So what would end up happening is that Europe was constantly at war somewhere. Like, you didn't get periods of peace. You got the idea of life being nothing but an unending struggle for power and control is a philosophy that only really could have come from Europe, because that was Europe's normal. But in West Asia and in China, you had this undulation. You had periods of time where it got really, really violent and really contested, and then it would drop, and you would have periods of peace anywhere for years, sometimes decades, before a new issue would crop up and prove to be problematic enough to cause another longer term period of war. Not to say that there weren't battles or skirmishes, but the massive political upheavals took more time to develop because the geography lent itself so much more strongly to stability. So knowing what sort of geography you have and how difficult is it to cross the borders, how easy is it for you to extend and maintain the control that you say you have, that matters a great deal as well.
So I can't speak to the truth or falsity of that claim, but it makes sense. And it relates a little bit to James C. Scott has a book called The Art of Not Being Governed. And it's primarily an anthropological look at the peoples of Southeast Asia who lived high in the mountains. And basically it's like, yeah, these central governments come and go. And they basically, like, when they try to rule us, it fails because we just live in such an inhospitable place.
It's not in their best interest to try and conquer it. It's too expensive for not worth the effort.
It's too expensive, and it's also something where it's so hard to extend power and not just get taken out by guerrilla warfare. And you have some other places that kind of reflect this too. So like in Peru, for example, where you had, I don't remember the tribe names at all right now, but I remember how there was the tribe that actually lived at a really high altitude, and then they ended up basically ruling over a bunch of the tribes from the valleys, but they basically couldn't operate. I mean, it's a completely different ecosystem. So you had a literally stratified society.
As it were.
Yeah.
Operating. You got to a new tribe.
Yeah, absolutely. And, similarly, like if you think about like swamp people or who's living out in the bayou or who's living up in the tundra, these are people who are in such punishing environments that it's not worth the while of the central power to actually maintain a presence that's able to project force.
Central powers need to be close to their resources. That's why river valleys were always the place where people would settle. You've got to have places that supply you well enough to be a central staging point. On the other hand, it also meant that those were always the first places to try and be conquered whenever anyone came through, because if you took those lands, you took the grain fields. If you took the grain fields, you took the supplies. If you took the supplies, you could keep the war going longer and have a better chance of success.
But the geography, so if you match the geography up with the technology, right, it gives you a sense of like, how am I able to project power? So for example, in going back to Western Europe, for example, it's really telling when you start looking at even pretty late, like go into the 1500s, into the 1600s, how, in a sense, close, like Moscow was so much closer to Paris than some places in France were to Paris because, sea travel was just so much easier than going overland into some weird place where there's bad roads. And in the same way, like, kind of a converse, Western, like the European colonists that American colonists going west, they talked about the inland ocean of the giant prairies.
Yes.
And it was basically considered like you can't traverse that. Like before they cut the rail across, it was really hazardous to cross. But you had tribes like the Comanche who had figured out how to cross it and had figured out horseback riding. and could basically project power across this massive amount of space because they could travel 400 miles into Mexico or 400 miles or 800 miles to Oklahoma or whatever, and do so on a scale that was just unimaginable to others at the day. So being able to match like the geographic system, the technology, and then the other thing that's really interesting, going off of like the Native Americans, but also I see this a little bit with Vikings, where we're watching the History Channel show right now, my wife and I, and you have a dynamic with both of those where you have like the chieftain and the warrior chief, and they're often two different people where you might have a bit of a push-pull role, and how that balances or doesn't balance.
Yeah. And it's like, who's really in charge here? Well, it might depend on the setting, and they might be constantly testing each other to find out that very question. But if you're on the outside, well, this is the chief and this is his warrior chieftain. But on the inside, you know, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Well, and when you're being pushed like that, like it's a very dynamic living arrangement. And then it kind of solidifies into what we experienced in Kuwait, where you basically have, well, these are the two ruling families, and we just go emir, crown prince, and rotate, you know, who's wearing the hat this time. And that's kind of like a settled, you know, I'm sure there was wars about that before that happened.
Yeah, that's not the sort of arrangement that people come to just on an average Thursday. No, like, that's something that happens because it's like, okay, I think we're a little tired of losing people to this conflict. We've got more people than just our families around here, and if we don't sort this out, they're going to supplant both of us. So let's keep what authority we have and come to enough of an amicable agreement that we don't lose our heads with the hats.
Yeah, you know, thinking back on the Selectorate theory too, I remember reading about when the Vikings took over, I think it was York, and basically treated the people, like once they ousted the rulers, they basically treated the people fine. You know, didn't force them to convert, didn't really bother them, just like, as long as you let us farm alongside you, like we don't have a quarrel with them. And generally we're just like good leaders. And so the people were like, all right, we'll roll with this. You know, there's no like, oh, I feel like we need to avenge our former leaders and, you know, oust these guys.
Leaders and go, well, screw that. Things are just fine.
Yeah, it's like, I don't really have a quarrel here. And I love, I mean, if it isn't obvious already, I mean, history is just such a wealth of fascinating things to poach from, and, you know, being able to like dive into. I particularly like, I want to reread Coriolanus from Shakespeare.
Okay.
It's one of his, it's a lesser known work, but it has a very Greek drama type thing where he's a war hero who comes home, and then internal politics at home basically end up exiling him. And so he ends up going and chums up with the guys he beat before and brings them back as an army.
So it's kind of like Odysseus in reverse almost.
Kind of, yeah. Yeah. It's a really fun play, but it also gets at, because you have this whole like domestic politics inside of the city, and then you have the external politics of the opposing city, and how War and Peace plays out in that relationship between the domestic politics and then the external expression of that.
I got you.
A couple other things that I kind of come to mind. China recently has been really projecting power into Africa through infrastructure investments and through cultural centers and sister city projects and things like that. So it's cool to not just have conflict, but like how do you link people up in interesting ways, and having a key relationship or having some kind of bridge by which you go, oh, I have a connection to this. And you know, in D&D, it's usually through like, oh, I'm from this country, or I have, you know, I'm a tiefling, and so therefore I know these people, or I speak this language, or what have you. But for things like Invisible Sun, I think one of the challenges with that game specifically is that the way it's structured by default is very, very individual forward. And groups don't really matter in a structural sense. They're almost more flavor for specific individuals. And making them weightier and balancing them out a little bit takes a little bit of care. And one way to do that is by putting these little alliances together where you have these partnerships, or you have this this one organization is actually parasitic upon another.
Yeah. Right.
So anyway, those are my 2 cents. Any last items you want to add on there? Otherwise, we can cut this ramble off.
No, not really anything coming to mind. I don't think I've said all that I have the desire to at the moment. Anything else will probably just be showing more ignorance.
I have lots more, but this doesn't need to turn into a full-blown notebook session. So I'll cut it off there for tonight, and I'll catch you another time.
All right.